Hi there, Steve Coffin. I want to follow up my previous video, which talked about how the most important thing in language learning was to have fun or to enjoy doing it. And that was whatever was enjoyable was effective. Now, I must admit that in some cases that's not always the case, but it's a good rule of thumb. It works a lot of the time. Related to that is the idea that in language learning, I always try to do the things that are the least amount of work. I like to do effortless language learning, and I borrow the word effortless from two sources. One is A.J. Hoge, Hogue, who is a great teacher of English via the internet. Hello, A.J., if you ever have a chance to see this video. A great man, and his channel and his website is called Effortless English. But when I wrote, my other source is is Taoist philosophy or Taoist philosophy. When I wrote my book, The Linguist, A Personal Guide to Language Learning, about, gosh, it's got to be 8 or 9 years ago, I began it with what I called the parable of the crooked tree, because Zhuangzi, who is a philosopher, a Taoist philosopher, whom I refer to in my book, and his basic principle in life was to just follow what was natural, what was effortless, and don't try and force things. And typically the Taoist philosophy was in opposition to Confucius, which had a whole bunch of rules of what you should do and shouldn't do in order to be a great person. And Zhuangzi had this parable of the crooked tree, where his friend says, this tree is crooked and its lumber is not good for anything, and your philosophy is not good for anything either. And Zhuangzi replied, well, yeah, that's because you have to make use of it for what its nature is. So, a crooked tree, you can sit underneath it in the shade. I'm in the lumber business. You can sometimes, some of those gnarly old trees produce very decorative lumber that's very expensive. Anyway, Taoism is also about effortless, wu wei. In other words, no effort. You're not fighting it. And I believe you learn better in that way. So I'm going to talk about all the things that I do that are easy and effortless, and therefore, in my opinion, more effective. And I made some notes here. So the first thing is, normally if I'm reading in a language where I read well enough to read away from the computer, I don't look up the words. It's too much trouble. On the other hand, if I can't read well enough, it's too much trouble to look words up in a dictionary, because the minute you close the dictionary, you forget the meaning. And so therefore, I read on a computer where I have an online dictionary, and where once I've looked the word up, as in link, it's then highlighted. So the next time I see it in any subsequent material, I can see that I've looked it up before. I can see the meaning and so forth. So I'm not, just looking words up in a dictionary and then having to forget them. Okay, another thing that's effortless. When you read grammar, and I believe we should read grammar rules, it kind of helps give us a sense of the language. Don't try to remember anything. Don't try to learn anything. Don't try to understand anything. Just treat it as a spark, an exposure of something that might help you eventually get a sense of the language. So don't worry about grammar. Don't do questions. If you're going through, and as I mentioned, I did find an old Teach Yourself Czech here that I had bought many, many years ago, and I thought I would try and learn Czech. And I found it kind of useful. I go through it. It has questions, grammar drills. I never do them. However, what is very useful is to go to the back of the book, and at the back of the book, you'll find the answers. So rather than asking, having to try to answer the question, racking your brain to come up with the right answer, just read all the answers, because then you'll get concentrated examples of whatever they're trying to test you on, whether it be the dative case or pronouns or anything else. So I find it useful more than once to read the answers to these questions. Again, it's effortless. I don't like doing the questions because it's too much work. By the same token, when I read something, I don't like answering comprehension questions. I would rather have misunderstood the text, have my own interpretation of the text, than have to answer somebody's question, where I have to think about, why did this and that and so forth. And I have mentioned before the great Brazilian educator who said that nothing destroys the pleasure of reading as much as being asked questions about what you have read or being asked to analyze what you have read. So I avoid all of that. I mentioned the other day that Russian textbook on history, which was a wonderful textbook, where they had 20 sort of pre-reading questions and I don't know how many post-reading questions. All of that is effort. I don't do it. It spoils the pleasure of reading and or listening. Flashcards. Again, I've now finally resolved, I didn't use flashcards very much, but I do find them a break. They're easy to do, and as long as they can be made as easy as possible. So I don't have the flashcard with, say, the check word on the front and then the answer on the back. I put everything on the front. So the check word, in our system we have the English translation and the captured phrase. I just look at the front and I go through them very quickly. I don't have to think. I'm just being exposed to them. There again, effortless. Another one is this gold list that I mentioned previously. I'm not convinced that it's effortless, but there are elements of it that are effortless because you only write the words down. You write them down and you leave it for 14 days. You don't try and rack your brain. You don't try to try to go over it again and again, forcing your brain to try to learn something that it isn't going to learn. The brain will learn naturally with enough exposure. It'll learn some things naturally, and it'll learn all things on its own schedule, and you can't force it. Yeah, here's another thing too. I mean, you sometimes get the purists that tell you that you must only use a monolingual dictionary. I never use a monolingual dictionary. It's much easier to use a bilingual dictionary. If I'm starting out in a language and, I have no words and they're going to, rather than, book, whatever, knee-high, if I don't know many words in Czech, a monolingual dictionary is useless. But even when I'm quite advanced, I just find that a bilingual dictionary, here's a word, bingo, I get this beginning of a hint of what that word might mean, and I know that only through a lot of exposure will I eventually get the hang of that word. But I don't want to spend my time trying to figure out what this Czech-to-Czech dictionary definition of that word is. I find it easier to use a bilingual dictionary. It, to me, is more effortless. And whatever's effortless, to me, is good. The other thing, too, is don't worry about things that you don't understand. And don't worry about, elements of the new language that are basically very strange to you. So one of the things I find, especially when in Asian languages, but not only, there's a tendency to introduce the names of every possible relative early on. And in English actually is quite poor in terms of defining family relationships. But other languages have many more words to denote your cousin, brother, your wife's mother, your father's father, I don't know, a third cousin, older brother, younger sister, whatever. It's in Korean, it's in Czech, and so I can't be bothered with it. Those are concepts we don't have in English. It's very difficult for me to understand. It doesn't really matter. Him, her, it's good enough. Similarly with some of these things that, if you're in a language where they don't have articles, like Russian or Japanese, you're going to find articles difficult in English. Don't worry about it. It's going to take a long time before those things sink in. Conversely, if I still don't understand all the explanations about the aspects of verbs in Russian, but I kind of naturally get it more. Some of the time I don't. I'm aware that this thing exists, but I've read the explanations. Nah, don't worry about things that are so very different. Similarly in Japanese, don't worry about polite language at first because it takes a lot of exposure in order to have a sense for that. So all I'm saying is when you're learning, it's kind of, I do believe in this sort of Taoist approach. Do what's easy, do what's effortless. Don't answer questions. Don't force yourself to learn things. Don't cram things into your brain. Just do it easily, exposure to the language, trust the brain, and I think you'll end up learning at least as well. So there you have it. Effortless language learning. Thank you for listening.